The Alpha King was supposed to marry her sister. Instead, he heard the bride think, "If he discovers who I really am, he'll kill everyone I love." His hand stopped halfway to the veil. The entire chapel waited for him to lift it. But the Alpha King wasn't looking at the woman beneath the lace anymore. He was listening. Don't shake. Don't cry. Just survive the ceremony. Let him believe you're the woman he was promised. His silver eyes narrowed. That wasn't his bride's voice. It was a stranger's, and somehow it was inside his head. He reached for the veil. The girl beneath it went rigid. "Please don't look at me." His fingers stopped. Then another thought struck him. My sister abandoned him. My father sent me here to die in her place. If this man learns the truth before the vows are finished, he'll destroy my family. The Alpha King's expression changed. Not anger, not disgust, something far more dangerous. Interest. He slowly lowered his hand. Everyone out. The command sent the entire chapel into stunned silence. The priest stared at him. The nobles exchanged frightened glances. Even the bride seemed confused. Then the Alpha King leaned closer to the veiled woman and spoke so quietly that only she could hear. "Tell me why you're wearing my future wife's dress." Her heart stopped. "He knows." The king smiled. "I heard that." She nearly forgot how to breathe, because no one was supposed to hear her thoughts. No one. Not even the man she had been sent to marry. He could have exposed her in front of the entire kingdom. He could have had her father's household stripped of everything it owned before the sun set. Instead, he found himself asking a far more dangerous question. Why would a man send his own daughter to die in his other daughter's place, unless someone had gone to considerable trouble to make certain it was this daughter, specifically, who ended up standing at his altar? The Alpha King did not yet know he was looking at the answer to a conspiracy years in the making. He only knew that the moment he heard the truth inside this stranger's heart, he no longer wanted the bride he'd been promised. He wanted to know her, and somewhere in the wanting, though he would not have admitted it yet even to himself, he had already begun the slow work of falling for a woman he knew almost nothing about, except the unguarded shape of her fear. Welcome to Moon Noir. If you have ever been given everything except the one thing you actually needed, this story is for you. Subscribe and like if this is your first time here. Let us begin. The chapel guards escorted Mara and the king to a private receiving room, and it was there, door bolted, that Caelan finally asked the question everyone else had been too afraid to. "Where is your sister?" "Gone," Mara said. 3 nights ago. She loved her childhood guard more than she ever wanted to be queen, and she left before anyone could stop her. And your father sent you instead of informing me. He told me if I refused, he'd claim I'd helped her escape. He said he'd send soldiers after my younger brothers. Her voice stayed steady, though her hands, folded in her lap, were not. "So I came, knowing I might have you executed for the deception. Yes. You still came. I told you. What choice did I have?" Caelan studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested the answer troubled him more than her family's cruelty did. "You should know something before you decide how afraid of me to be," he said. "I don't hear everything, not deliberately, and not at will. Surface thoughts, frightened ones, anything urgent or deeply felt enough to slip free before you can stop it. I can't simply reach into your mind and take what I want from it, and I wouldn't, even if I could." That's meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be true. His eyes held hers. "I would rather you trust the rule than trust my restraint. Rules don't change their minds." A man who wanted his daughter erased quietly would have simply let her disappear, along with her sister, he continued. He would not have sent a second daughter directly into a king's private chapel, dressed in the first one's gown, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Mara frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, whoever arranged this did not intend for you to simply vanish into my household unnoticed." His silver eyes had gone distant, calculating. "They intended for you to be seen, by me, specifically." The observation unsettled her more than his anger would have. "You think someone wanted me here. I think your father is not clever enough to have thought of this alone." Caelan's jaw tightened. Someone advised him, someone patient enough to have been waiting a long time for the right moment. He did not yet have a name for that person. 3 seats behind where the council would eventually gather, a silver-haired man in dark ceremonial robes watched the closed chapel doors. His expression revealed nothing. He had expected the substitution to create confusion, perhaps a quiet scandal the council could argue over for a season. He had not expected the Alpha King to clear the entire chapel and vanish behind closed doors with the girl alone. And, for the first time that morning, the man looked uncertain. Whatever he had intended by placing her at Caelan's altar, the plan had just changed. That night, in the palace that would become her home, Mara lay awake, turning over a question that had nothing to do with kings or conspiracies. She thought of the family dog from her childhood, a scarred old wolf named Bram, who had guarded her father's house for as long as she could remember, and of the one night she had never told anyone about. She had been 7. Her father, furious over a debt he blamed on a visiting tradesman, had commanded Bram to attack the man in the courtyard. Bram had obeyed. He always obeyed. But Mara, watching from the stairwell, had felt something twist in her own chest at the exact moment the command took hold of him. A wrongness, a silence behind his eyes, as though some part of him had been shoved out of the way to make room for someone else's will. She remembered reaching toward him without thinking, some instinct older than her 7 years, and for one impossible second, Bram had hesitated mid-lunge, his whole body trembling with a choice he hadn't been permitted to have. Her father had struck her for interfering before she understood what she'd nearly done. She had never tried it again. She had told her mother about the silence behind Bram's eyes, once, and her mother had gone very still and told her never to say such a thing to anyone else. She had assumed, for 22 years, that this was simply one more strange, useless thing about herself, filed away alongside all the other reasons she had never quite belonged. She did not yet understand that it was the first thread of something considerably larger than her own childhood. She only knew, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar palace, that the king 2 rooms away might hear any thought that slipped free of her without warning, and that some reckless, exhausted part of her found that less frightening than she expected it to. 6 days after the abandoned wedding ceremony, Caelan and Mara were legally married in private before the High Council. The coronation, however, would wait until the kingdom understood exactly who its new queen was. It was Caelan, not Mara, who insisted the marriage happen at all. "You could send me home," she told him the morning of, quietly. "No one outside this palace would ever need to know I wasn't Severin. They would know within the week," he said, "and the moment they did, whoever arranged your presence here would understand they'd lost the one piece they didn't expect me to keep." He met her eyes. "I would rather they believe I chose this deliberately. It keeps you considerably safer than the truth would." It was not, she understood, a declaration of anything beyond strategy. But those 6 days were not spent in negotiation. They were spent, unexpectedly, in small, unremarkable moments that Mara would later understand had mattered more than any council decision. On the second night, unable to sleep, she found the kitchens and discovered Caelan already there, sleeves pushed up, tending a torn ear on a half-grown pup one of the border patrols had brought in injured. He didn't hear her approach, or if he did, he said nothing, and she stood in the doorway for several minutes, simply watching the most feared wolf in the Northern Territories murmur something low and steady to a frightened animal too young to know his reputation. "You do this yourself," she said finally, "not the physician." "The physician frightens them," he said, not looking up. "I don't." She never mentioned it to anyone, but she found herself, after that, watching for the moments underneath the crown rather than the crown itself. On the third day, she passed a young servant carrying linens with a fresh burn wrapped clumsily across her palm. She shouldn't be working with that, Mara thought, distracted, already moving on to whatever the day required of her. She did not know Caelan had heard it until that evening, when the same servant appeared at dinner with her hand properly bandaged, and mentioned, shyly, that the king himself had ordered her sent to the physician that afternoon. He heard me, Mara thought, startled all over again by how easily it kept happening. "I did," Caelan said, from across the table, not looking up from his letters. She had learned, by then, that the rule ran deeper than he'd first explained it. He could not hear a thought deliberately handed to him, only the ones that slipped free on their own, unguarded, honest in a way she rarely chose to be out loud. That distinction mattered to her more than she expected. It meant every private thing he knew about her he had earned by accident, not by asking. On the fourth morning, over a breakfast she hadn't touched, he asked her, without any apparent reason, what she actually wanted to eat. She blinked at him. "It doesn't matter. It does to me." "Nobody's ever asked me that before," she admitted, and heard, too late, how much that had cost her to say aloud. He didn't press it, and didn't offer sympathy either, which she found she preferred. He simply had the kitchens send up something different the next morning, and the one after that, small and unremarkable, and she understood, slowly, that he was teaching her something no one else in her life had bothered to, that her choices, even the smallest ones, were allowed to matter. On the fifth afternoon, he returned from training, damp and breathing hard, and Mara, seated by the window with a book she wasn't reading, thought, entirely without meaning to, "Why does he have to look like that?" Caelan stopped in the doorway. "Like what?" Her face went instantly, thoroughly red. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to. I hate this ability of yours." "You've mentioned that." He was almost smiling now, the closest she'd seen him come to it. Repeatedly. "Get out. This is my chamber." "Get out anyway." He left, laughing quietly, and she sat there afterward with her face still burning, furious, and beneath the fury, unmistakably pleased, and understood that whatever was happening between them had stopped being simple strategy several days ago, without either of them formally agreeing to it. It was in the palace archive, that same week, that the first true thread of her mother's history surfaced. Caelan, working through old household ledgers out of some instinct he couldn't yet name, found a dismissal record half a lifetime old. E. Vane, released from service, cause unrecorded. Filed the same year Mara was born. He said nothing of it to her yet. He wanted, he told himself, to be certain before he gave her one more thing to be afraid of. He did not examine too closely why some quieter part of him also simply wanted a few more days of her before anything else about her changed. The council convened a week later to formally contest the marriage, and it was there that Mara first proved she was not merely the frightened replacement the room assumed her to be. "The treaty requires the eldest daughter," Lady Vera said, when the council had gathered, and Mara stood beside Caelan, beneath 12 unimpressed stares. "She is legally the eldest daughter available," Caelan answered. That is not what the treaty states. It states that the daughter presented at the altar shall become queen. His voice cooled. She was presented. The matter is settled. A councilman near the far end of the table, silver-haired, dressed in dark ceremonial robes, leaned forward with a mildness that did not match his eyes. And what exactly does Her Majesty bring to the crown, beyond a fortunate technicality? Prove it, he said, smiling, when Caelan answered that she noticed things the rest of the room didn't. Mara looked around the chamber, and this time she let herself actually see it, the way she'd learned to see rooms her entire life, cataloguing what nobody wanted noticed. The Eastern Guard's scabbard is worn on the wrong side, she said. He didn't train with that sword. He was given it recently. She paused. And the man standing behind Lady Vera hasn't spoken once, in an hour, in a room where everyone else has fought to be heard. He's pretending to be a servant. The disguised man's hand moved. Too fast. Caelan caught his wrist before the blade cleared his sleeve, and the chamber dissolved into chaos, guards rushing forward, the assassin's arm twisted and pinned against the table. The lower tunnels, Mara said, noticing the mud on his boots, though there had been no mud outside, only unbroken snow. Caelan's eyes found hers, something unmistakably proud beneath the alarm. Search the western foundations. Guards dragged the failed assassin away. The council sat frozen, and the silver-haired man, watching from his seat with an expression of carefully arranged concern, understood, more clearly than anyone else in that room, exactly what he was looking at. Not a girl who had gotten fortunate. A girl whose blood was finally beginning to wake. It was Lady Vera, once order had returned, who produced the document that changed the shape of everything. We ran a genealogical inquiry on the bride presented by the Crescent House, she said, placing it before the council. The results are unusual. Caelan read it in silence. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped, then lifted slowly toward a portrait hanging in the eastern gallery he had passed 1,000 times without truly seeing. A woman beside his grandmother, wearing a pendant shaped like a crescent moon. "Bring the archivist," he said. The old man arrived pale and reluctant. He looked at the portrait, then at Mara, then back at the portrait, and his face drained of what little colour it had held. "Who is she?" Caelan asked. The old man swallowed. "Your Majesty." "Who is she? Who is she?" His eyes finally settled on Mara, and something in them had already surrendered before he spoke. "The woman who should have inherited this throne, before your family erased her name from every record that could prove it." Mara felt the room disappear around her. "My mother?" The archivist lowered his head. "Yes, that's impossible," Mara said. "No," Caelan said slowly, something settling into place behind his eyes that he did not yet have words for. "What's impossible is that everyone in this palace has spent 23 years pretending she never existed at all." The ancient bell began ringing that same night, a sound the eldest guards swore had not been heard in 73 years, and every wolf in the palace went still at once, as though something old and half-forgotten had finally opened its eyes. The archivist, finally cornered into honesty, led them to a passage beneath the old throne room that no living servant knew existed, its walls carved with symbols older than the kingdom itself, crescents, thorns, and eyes that were not quite wolf eyes. At the bottom waited a circular door with no handle, only a shallow indentation shaped exactly like the pendant Mara had inherited from a mother she barely remembered. "Only the daughter of the erased line may open what the crown buried." She placed the pendant into the stone. The door opened onto a chamber larger than the throne room above, and at its center, atop a black stone throne, a figure of moonlight gathered into the shape of a woman Mara had seen only in half-remembered dreams. Mara. Mother? Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. You were never hidden because you were weak, the apparition said. Mara's breath caught. Then why was I hidden? Her mother's expression changed, something aching moving across it. Because they were afraid of what would happen when you remembered who you were. Mara reached for her, uselessly, moonlight passing through her fingers. Who should I trust? The apparition's gaze moved, briefly, to Caelan, standing frozen at the chamber's threshold. Not the man who wants the crown on your head. Her voice was already weakening, the moonlight thinning at the edges like a candle guttering in wind. Trust the one who would give it away. Then she was gone, and the chamber went dark, and Mara was left with a warning that raised far more questions than it answered. It was the archivist, shaken and finally out of reasons to withhold anything, who filled in the rest in the hours that followed. Eleanor Vane, first daughter of a royal line older than the current crown, half-sister to Caelan's own father, forced into hiding when the palace decided her bloodline carried something too dangerous to let survive within its walls. An old, near-forgotten power, capable of breaking the obedience bond every ruling wolf had used to command their people for 3 centuries. Then that's what I am, Mara said quietly. Not a substitute bride. A threat someone decided to bury 23 years ago, and never quite finished burying. Caelan said nothing for a long moment. I don't care what you are, he said finally. I cared what you were before I knew any of this. That hasn't changed simply because now I have a name for it. She wanted, badly, to believe that mattered more than the bloodline did. She was beginning to. The fracture came from a source neither of them expected. Master Orin, the archivist, finally surrendered a sealed record he'd been guarding for 11 years, and it was Caelan, not Mara, who broke first while reading it. My father, he said, voice flat in a way she'd never heard from him, ordered the record of your mother's death falsified. He knew she hadn't died. He simply needed the kingdom to believe she had, because if the old bloodline was known to survive, it would have threatened the entire foundation his reign was built on. You didn't know. That has never once excused anyone, in the history of this palace, from the harm their family built before they were born. He looked at her, something almost pleading beneath the composure. You have every right to hate what my blood did to yours. She considered it honestly, rather than offering comfort she didn't yet feel. I don't hate you, she said finally, but I need you to understand that I can't simply set it aside because you're sorry. My mother spent her entire life afraid of a family that includes yours. I need time before that stops meaning anything when I look at you. It was the first real distance between them since the chapel, and Caelan, to his credit, did not try to argue her out of it. He simply nodded and gave her the space she'd asked for, and did not attempt to hear the thoughts she was clearly working hard to keep from him during the difficult week that followed. That restraint, more than any declaration could have, was what began closing the distance again. I don't forgive your father, she told him, one quiet evening, but I've stopped needing you to answer for him. That's not the same as forgiveness. No, she agreed. It's better. It's mine. The council, unmoved by any private reconciliation, forced the next crisis on its own terms. Lady Vera convened an emergency session while Caelan was occupied elsewhere, and word of it reached Mara only after the council had already spent an hour arguing that a queen whose bloodline could unmake the obedience bond binding every wolf in the kingdom was not a queen at all, but a standing threat the crown could not afford to keep. Several members proposed the marriage be quietly dissolved before the coronation made it irreversible. One suggested, more bluntly than the others dared, that the safest resolution was one that did not require Mara's survival. Mara heard about the vote from a servant before Caelan ever mentioned it to her at all, and that silence frightened her more than the vote itself. "You knew," she said, finding him afterward. "You knew this morning, and you said nothing." "I was handling it. That isn't the same as telling me. I didn't want you to spend the day afraid of a vote I intended to defeat regardless. I would rather be afraid and informed than protected and kept in the dark," she said. "My whole life has been men deciding what I'm strong enough to be told. I need you to be different from that, Caelan, not simply kinder about it." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched something genuinely uncertain cross his face for the first time since the chapel. "If the council votes to remove, you and I overrule them," he said slowly. "I fracture the very structure that lets me protect anyone in this kingdom, including you, going forward. If I don't overrule them, then you'll have chosen the crown. I haven't chosen anything." "Not choosing is still a choice, Caelan. You more than anyone should understand that." She left him standing in the corridor, and for 2 days neither of them spoke of it directly, though she felt, for the first time since the chapel, genuinely uncertain which way he would decide when the vote finally came due. It came due on the 3rd morning, and Caelan did not simply overrule the council quietly, the way she'd half expected. He stood before them and told them plainly that any vote to remove her would be a vote to remove him alongside her, because he would abdicate before he signed an order against a woman whose only crime was surviving a bloodline she'd never asked to carry. The vote collapsed before it was fully called. Mara did not thank him for it, not exactly. She simply found him afterward and said, "You didn't have to make it that absolute." "I know," he said. "I wanted you to stop wondering." She had. That, more than any of the quiet kindnesses before it, was what finally convinced her the distance between them had closed for good. It was during that same difficult week that something small happened in the training yard, something Mara nearly dismissed entirely. A young guard's hound had been commanded to hold its position at the yard's edge while the men trained, and Mara, passing by, noticed the same wrongness she remembered from Bram's eyes 20 years earlier. A rigid, glassy stillness that had nothing to do with obedience freely given. Without quite deciding to, she found herself crouching beside it, murmuring nothing in particular, simply present. The hound's ears twitched. Then, astonishingly, it broke position and pressed its head against her hand, trembling, before its handler noticed and barked it back into place. She said nothing about it to anyone. She told herself it meant nothing, that dogs simply liked her, that she was imagining the same old strangeness in 100 ordinary moments because her mother's blood had recently given her a reason to look for it. But she noticed, turning it over later that night, that it had felt exactly like the moment in the courtyard when she was 7, smaller, quieter, but unmistakably the same door, cracked open again after 20 years of believing it had only ever existed in her own head. The council chamber erupted into chaos 4 nights later, when a disguised guard, working for the same silver-haired councilman Mara, now recognized from every dangerous turn since the chapel, attempted to seize her during a blackout he'd engineered himself. Caelan broke his wrist before the blade could clear its sheath, and it was the man's dying confession, gasped out before he lost consciousness, that shattered the last comfortable assumption Mara had been carrying. "Your sister didn't run from love," he rasped. "She ran because Lord Severin told her exactly what would happen to the family if she stayed and refused the marriage. He gave her no real choice at all. He simply made sure it looked like one. Severin." Mara turned the name over, and it settled into place beside every quiet, careful, watchful moment she now remembered him occupying. always near the edges of the worst nights. She knew, Mara said slowly. She knew what would happen to me. She was told her sister would simply be sent home in disgrace. Not that she'd be sent to the altar in her place. His breathing was ragged now, fading. He needed one daughter gone, and one daughter delivered. It never mattered to him which was which, only that it happened. His prisoner, not his ally, she has been since the night she left. The palace bells began ringing again, before Mara could ask anything further, and Severin's voice, cold and amused, carried down from the shattered balcony where he'd been watching the entire confession unfold. "You have until dawn," he called. "Bring Mara to the fortress before dawn, or your sister dies." Then he was gone, into the dark, and Mara stood shaking beside a king whose hand found hers, without either of them deciding it should. "She's alive," Mara said, "and she's been his prisoner this entire time, not his accomplice." "Then we're getting her back," Caelan said, "and you owe her a conversation you didn't know you needed to have." They found Ilara 3 days later, chained in a fortress cell, thinner than Mara remembered, her once easy confidence worn down to something quieter and considerably more careful. Neither sister spoke at first. "I thought you'd hate me," Ilara said finally. "I did, for a while," Mara admitted. "I thought you knew exactly what leaving would cost me, and left anyway. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what he'd do to you. He told me you'd simply be sent home." Ilara's voice cracked. "But I knew something would happen to someone. I knew father wouldn't simply let the marriage collapse quietly. I ran anyway, and told myself that made me a coward, instead of asking what it might cost you." "Do you know what hurt most?" Mara asked quietly. Ilara looked at her, bracing. "That I left? That I wasn't surprised." The words came out steadier than Mara expected. "You were always the one who mattered first, Ilara. Not because you asked to be, just because that's how the house was built. So when you ran and left the cost to me, some part of me barely even registered it as a betrayal. It just felt like the shape our whole lives had always taken." Ilara wept. Finally, the composure Mara remembered from childhood breaking entirely. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. For every year I let you disappear into corners, so I wouldn't have to notice how much easier it was for me." "I know," Mara said. "I think I've known for years. I just needed you to say it." It was not a complete reconciliation. There was too much between them for one conversation to close entirely. But it was, Mara understood, a beginning considerably more honest than the pretty apology she'd once imagined wanting. Severin met them in the fortress's lower hall, unhurried, entirely unsurprised. "You found her," he said. "Good. That saves considerable time." "You built all of this," Caelan said. "The substitution, the wedding, all of it." "Of course I did." Severin did not bother denying it. He turned, unhurried, and walked a slow circle around the hall as he spoke, the way a man walks when he has rehearsed something for years and finally has an audience worth telling it to. "Your father-in-law is not a subtle man. He is a frightened one. Frightened men are easily guided toward decisions they believe are entirely their own." "You didn't choose Mara because she was expendable," Caelan said. Severin stopped walking. "No," his eyes moved to Mara. "I chose her because everyone else believed she was expendable. Only I knew what was sleeping inside you." "Why?" Mara said. "Why did it need to be me, in that chapel, specifically?" Severin didn't answer immediately. He crossed instead to a narrow table against the wall, where a black lacquered box sat waiting, and opened it without ceremony. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a second pendant, twin to the one Mara wore, its crescent edge worn smooth from decades of handling. "Your mother's line and the crown's line were bound together long before either of you were born," he said, turning the pendant over in his fingers rather than looking at her. "A dormant bloodline does not wake itself. It wakes in proximity to power it recognizes as kin. I needed you married into it." "And once it woke," Caelan said, understanding arriving cold and complete, "you intended it to answer to you instead of her." "Yes." He set the pendant down. For a moment, something shifted behind his composure, old and unhealed, and his voice, when it came again, had lost its rehearsed smoothness entirely. "I was 11 when an uncontrolled pack burned my mother's village to the ground. No one commanded them to. That was the horror of it. No one was holding anything at all." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. Whatever lived behind that single sentence had clearly cost him nothing to remember and everything to say aloud. "You were supposed to be alone," he added, looking at Mara now, with something almost like genuine irritation, the composure sliding back into place as quickly as it had slipped. "Isolated, easy to eventually direct. That was always the design." "You made one mistake," Caelan said. "Which was?" Caelan looked at Mara. "You thought she would stay alone." Severin's mouth thinned. "Sentiment does not unmake 300 years of careful architecture, Your Majesty." "No," Mara said, "but choice does. And that's the one thing your architecture never accounted for." Severin raised one hand, and every guard in the hall dropped their weapons at once, eyes going silver, heads lowering in unnatural unison. "I gave them something you cannot break," he said. "Fear runs deeper than choice ever will." Mara stepped forward anyway. She understood, finally, standing in that hall, exactly what her strange, useless childhood sensitivity had always been preparing her for. The courtyard, Bram's trembling hesitation, the silence behind his eyes that no one else had ever believed was real. "You can refuse," she said quietly, to the kneeling guards. Nothing happened, not immediately. Severin's hold was old and deep, layered across dozens of minds at once, and reaching all of them, nearly buckled her knees the way it had the single wolf in the council chamber weeks before. But this time, she didn't try to overpower the command. She listened beneath it, the way her mother's blood had always known how to, and found, buried under every layer of fear Severin had built, the same small, stubborn thing she'd spent her whole life protecting in herself. A choice, tiny, still alive. "You don't have to obey him," she said. "Not because I'm telling you not to, because it was never really his to demand." One guard lifted his head, then another. The silver drained from their eyes one by one, not because Mara had commanded it, but because she had simply reminded each of them that the door had never actually been locked. Severin's composure finally broke. "That is not power. That is surrender." "No," Mara said. "It's the opposite of what you've spent your whole life building. You watched a village burn because no one held its edges, and you decided the only answer was to hold everyone's edges forever, for all of them, whether they asked you to or not. I'm not afraid of what happens when people are actually free to choose. You never let yourself find out whether you should be." Severin's laugh was thin, unsteady, the first crack in 40 years of certainty. "You think you're freeing them. You're not. You're only replacing my command with your own. They obeyed me because I told them to. Now they'll credit their freedom to you, and follow you just as blindly, and call it something nobler than obedience because you're gentler about demanding it." Mara went still, the accusation landing somewhere she hadn't guarded. Then she looked at the guards around her, no longer kneeling, no longer silver-eyed, several of them already lowering weapons they'd only moments ago been forced to raise against their own king. "No," she said, quiet and certain. "If this were my command, they'd still be looking at me instead of deciding for themselves what happens next. She nodded toward the nearest guard, already backing away toward Caelan's line, without being told to. I didn't tell him to do that. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. That's the entire difference you spent 40 years refusing to see. Severin had no answer for that. It was, perhaps, the first time in his life someone had proven him wrong, using the very thing he'd spent decades trying to prevent. Caelan moved the moment Severin's hold broke, and the fight that followed was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided once the guards Severin had commanded stood instead beside their king. Severin was taken alive, dragged from the hall, still insisting, futilely, that he had only ever tried to protect a kingdom too foolish to protect itself. The night before the coronation, 6 months after the chapel ceremony that had never been completed, Mara found Caelan alone on the palace balcony, the same place Severin had once vanished into the snow. "You should be resting," he said, without turning. "So should you." She came to stand beside him, watching the dark tree line. Ilara, asleep somewhere down the corridor, for the first time in months without a locked door between them. "Tomorrow they'll call you queen," Caelan said. "The whole kingdom will kneel and use a title neither of us fully believes you need. And tonight, you're simply Mara." He turned to face her fully. "I wanted you to have at least one night where nothing was decided for you, and nothing was expected of you, and no one in this entire palace needed anything from you at all." She looked at him for a long moment, thinking of everything that had happened since the chapel, the pup in the kitchens, the burned servant, the breakfast she'd never been asked about before him, the ridiculous, furious. Why does he have to look like that? He'd never once let her live down. "I love him." Caelan went very still. She heard herself think it half a second after he must have, and felt her whole face go hot. "You heard that?" "Yes. You weren't supposed to." "I know." A pause, something unguarded moving across his face. "But I was hoping you'd think it anyway." She laughed, startled and undone, and it was the truest sound she'd made since the chapel. "I love you," she said again, deliberately this time, out loud, giving him the words, instead of letting him simply take them. "I know," he said. "I've known for days. I was only waiting for you to catch up." The following morning, before the assembled kingdom, Caelan did not simply present her as his queen. "There is no treaty that made her mine to claim," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "No bloodline that gave her this crown by right, and no law in this kingdom that will decide whether she keeps it. Every person who tried to control her life has already lost. I will not become one more." He turned to Mara. "Do you choose it?" The entire hall waited. Not for a king's decree, for a woman's answer. "I do," she said, "not because I was sent here, not because of what's in my blood, because I want this life, with these people, beside this man, on my own terms." "Then I choose you too," Caelan said, "not because I have to, because I would choose you in every version of this story where I had any choice at all." He kissed her before the entire kingdom, and the hall erupted into a sound that was not fear and was not obedience, but something the old bloodline had not heard directed at a throne in 300 years. Genuine, unforced joy. 6 months earlier, beneath a chapel veil, Caelan had believed he was about to marry another woman. He had thought the stranger beneath the lace was a mistake, a deception, a problem requiring a solution. He had been wrong. She had been the only truth anyone had brought into that chapel. And the strangest part, he thought, watching her laugh among the crowd that had once feared her as a threat and now simply loved her as their queen, was that he had never fallen for her because she was destined for a crown. He had fallen for her because he had heard the thoughts she was too frightened to say aloud, the lonely ones, the foolish ones, the brave ones, the ones about her sister, the ones about her family, the ones, eventually, about him. And one, at the very end, she had never intended him to hear at all. Mara caught him watching her and smiled, then leaned close enough that only he could hear her over the noise of the hall. "You don't have to hear this one," she said. Caelan smiled. "I don't." "Good." She took his hand. "Then I'll tell you." "Tell me what?" "That I chose you." For once, Caelan did not reach for her thoughts. He didn't need to. She held his hand openly, before the entire kingdom, and did not let go. The woman who had entered his chapel pretending to be someone else had finally become exactly who she was meant to be. Not because a prophecy had chosen her, not because her blood had demanded it, not because a king had claimed her, but because, at last, she had chosen herself. And then she chose him. Which moment stayed with you the most? Tell me in the comments. And if you want another Moon Noir story where love begins with a secret nobody was supposed to discover, subscribe. Moon Noir,